And Jesus said unto him, Thou sayest. Now we talked last week about who that governor was. That was Pontius Pilate, a Roman governor who was over this region of which Jerusalem was a part. And so as the scribes and Pharisees were attempting to put Jesus Christ to death, they were not lawfully allowed to or legally allowed to put forth a death sentence. And so it had to be the Roman governor that did this. And so even though the Jews themselves had already essentially convicted Christ to death, they needed that official authorization. And so they bring him here before Pilate. And so it says that Jesus stood before the governor. The governor said unto him, Art thou the king of the Jews? And Jesus said unto him, Thou sayest. And in verse 12, and when he was accused of the chief priests and elders, he answered nothing. Then said Pilate unto him, Hearest thou not how many things they witness against thee? And he answered him to never a word, insomuch that the governor marveled greatly. So this is where we're going to jump between a couple of different passages because it gives us a more clear picture of what is going on here. So we know that the scribes and Pharisees have brought Jesus before Annas the high priest, Caiaphas, and now they're bringing him before Pilate, the governor. And all of this is taking place in a relatively short amount of time. So they're really pushing the judiciary process through. So earlier in the evening, they have led him before Caiaphas, before Annas, and probably just within a couple of hours afterwards, he's here before Pilate. And so we'll see the people's accusations against him if we look in Luke chapter 23. Luke chapter 23. And it says in verse 1, And the whole multitude of them arose and led him unto Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, We found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidding to give tribute to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ a king. And Pilate answered him, saying, Art thou the king of the Jews? And he answered him and said, Thou sayest it. So let's kind of take this in context. So the people, the chief priests, don't have any valid reason to put Jesus Christ to death. He hasn't done anything. The only thing that they can potentially convict him on that the people will accept is the charge of blasphemy, calling himself God. But the only way that can actually be blasphemy is if it's not true. And they weren't able to prove that Christ was not God because of the miracles that he did, because of his popularity with the people. Many of the people were ready to believe that. If Jesus Christ would set himself up as king, they were ready to believe that he was the Messiah. So even the charge of blasphemy was not really enough to sway everybody against Jesus Christ, but even more so Pilate. Pilate was a Roman governor. A conviction of blasphemy wasn't going to hold water. If the Jews brought Jesus Christ before a Roman governor who didn't believe in their God and said, we need you to put him to death, he said that he is God. Pilate's going to say, why does that matter to me? Pilate was very familiar with the idea of a man being considered God. The Roman emperor at that time was set up as a figure to worship. He was set up as a god on earth. And so Pilate would not have taken this type of an accusation and immediately entered a death sentence. So they had to spin it in such a way that Pilate could be justified to put Jesus to death. So let's look at these accusations. It says in verse 2 of Luke 23, they began to accuse him, saying, We found this fellow perverting the nation or in other words, that they had found him stirring things up. When it says that they found him perverting the nation, forbidding to give tribute to Caesar. Not that Jesus Christ was not paying tribute or not paying his taxes, but that he was preaching to others that they shouldn't pay their taxes, that he was causing people to be incited to riot, that he was turning them against the Roman government. And saying and forbidding to give tribute to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ, a king. And so at this point is where we see, if we were just to look in Matthew, verse 11, they bring him before the governor, and he immediately says, "Art thou the king of the Jews?" So we have to look at this in context, right? It wasn't just that Pilate, without any idea of what was going on, said, "Are you the king of the Jews?" No, the people accused him of saying these things and of acting in this way. So essentially, they had to try to show that Jesus was guilty of crimes against the Roman government. He had to be convicted of a political crime, that it would be more beneficial to Rome to put him to death than to let him go. If they could prove that he was stirring up the people, that he was causing them to turn against the Roman government, then that would be much more likely of a case. And so Pilate here begins to cross-examine Jesus. Are you the king of the Jews? Okay, they're saying that you are talking about this. They're saying that you're calling yourself Christ a king. Are you the king of the Jews? And he answered him, said, "Thou sayest it," or what you've said is what's true. Now let's go ahead and turn into the book of John. Book of John, chapter 18, and verse 33. John 18:33. It says, "And Pilate entered into the judgment hall again." So the people had already brought up this accusation. And if we look a little bit earlier on in the passage, in verse 29, Pilate then went out unto them and said, "What accusation bring you against this man?" He wasn't going to just hold trial without there being a valid cause for him getting up out of bed. Again, it's at nighttime. There would have to be a valid reason for Pilate to even hold a trial. "What accusation bring you against this man?" They answered and said unto him, "If he were not a malefactor," another word for a malefactor is like a robber or a criminal. If he were not a criminal, we would not have delivered him up unto thee. So they're kind of skirting around the issue, aren't they? Pilate's saying, "What are you accusing this guy of?" They're saying, "Well, if he wasn't a criminal, we wouldn't have brought him to you." They're not saying what he's guilty of. They're just saying, "Well, you can trust us. He's obviously a bad guy, or we wouldn't have gotten you up at night." And so Pilate says, "Take you him and judge him according to your law." He's saying, why are you bringing this to me? If he's a criminal, you have a law. You have authority by the Roman government to hold your own court. You be the ones to judge him. Judge him according to your law. Don't bring this to me unless it's something that I specifically need to pass judgment on. The Jews said unto him, "It is not lawful for us to put any man to death." So again, they're not specifically stating why he's guilty of death, because they don't have a valid reason. They're simply saying, "We say he's a criminal. You should believe us. Our law doesn't allow us to put people to death. Yours does. Why don't you do us a favor here?" It goes on in verse 32 that the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spake, signifying what death he should die. In other words, the death that they're talking about is not just any type of death, it's actual crucifixion. Their law did not contain the authority to crucify any individual. Then Pilate entered into the judgment hall again. So at this point, I think he's probably tired of talking in circles with the church rulers, the chief priests. And so he comes into the judgment hall, and this is where we saw in the book of Luke that they accused him. Okay, so finally they're going to collect their accusation and say, oh, well, he said that people shouldn't pay taxes. He said that he is Christ a king. And so Pilate enters again and called Jesus and said, art thou the King of the Jews? And this is an interesting conversation, and that's why I have us turn here, because this conversation between Jesus and Pilate is important. Jesus says, sayest thou this thing of thyself, or did others tell it thee of me? So, in other words, what he's saying is this something, are you asking me this question, or is it that the chief priest said that I'm the King of the Jews? In other words, why are you asking? Are you asking me because it's something I'm being convicted of, or is it because you want to legitimately know? Is it because you have heard of who I say I am? Is it because you are wondering if I'm actually the Christ? And Pilate says, am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you unto me. What have you done? I'm not the one on trial here, is what Pilate's saying. I'm not a Jew. I don't have anything to do with these disputes that you have with the chief priests. Whatever you've done, they are angry enough at you to want to put you to death. Okay, so I'm giving you a chance to testify on your own behalf. What have you done? Jesus answered, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight, that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now is my kingdom not from hence. So in other words, what Jesus is saying here is he's giving Pilate the difference between a spiritual kingdom and a physical kingdom. Is Pilate concerned about a physical kingdom or a spiritual kingdom? Pilate, he's Roman. He's concerned about a physical kingdom. He is concerned about Rome. Rome is the one that gave him authority. Rome is the one that puts money in his pockets. So he's concerned about the physical. Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. He's saying that the kingdom that we're talking about are two totally different things. If my kingdom were of this world, then you would be hearing about it. You would be seeing the riots in the streets. You would be seeing the conflict. You don't see that because that's not my purpose. My purpose isn't to bring conflict. My kingdom is not of this world. Pilate said unto him, art thou a king then? So he's trying to get more information into the matter. Why exactly are the Jews wanting him dead? Jesus said, thou sayest that I am a king. To this end was I born, and for this cause came I into the world, that I should bear witness unto the truth. Everyone that is of the truth heareth my voice. So, and I want to explain exactly what he's saying here, because this is what we base our belief in Christ on, is that he's saying, so he says, you say that I am a king. This is my purpose. This is the reason that I was born, to tell the truth, to give the truth, to bear witness of the truth. Everyone that is of the truth hears my voice. In other words, the chief priests and the scribes, they do not hear my voice. In other words, they're not listening to me. They're not seeing what I have to say is truthful, and so therefore they're not of the truth. In other words, can you trust them? Can you trust that what they are saying is the truth? My purpose in coming to this world is the truth, is to bear witness of the truth. In other words, any time that Pilate asked Christ a question, trying to figure out, is he actually a threat to Roman authority? Christ brings it back to the purpose of why he came. And the reason for that is not to take over Rome. It's not to spread violence. It wasn't to gather the people and revolt. The purpose for Jesus Christ coming was for a spiritual kingdom. It was a kingdom of souls. It was to gather people unto him that they might be saved. That physical kingdom that Pilate is talking about, that comes later. It wasn't any danger to Rome. Rome was going to be gone by thousands of years by the time that Jesus Christ would come again. He is of no threat to Rome. What he is a threat to is the chief priests, because they are liars, because they are hypocrites. Pilate says unto him in verse 38, what is truth? And that's just where we can see the cynicism of the Romans, that they really didn't have they didn't have the truth. They didn't have the Word of God, but they also had a very skewed idea of what truth in general was. And it's kind of the same idea that people have today, that we make our own truth. I'm sure we've all heard people say, well, I'm living my truth. Okay, well, you can do that, but that doesn't mean that your truth is the truth. Whenever you die and it's time for the judgment before God, is God going to judge us according to whether we lived our truth or whether we lived his truth? And so that's what our focus has to be. And that's why Christ was able to say, everyone that is of the truth hears my voice, because he is the truth, not a truth. Okay? Every religion has their own idea of what truth is. But again, there's a difference between a truth and the truth. The truth is steadfast. The truth doesn't move. It doesn't matter what we say against it or what somebody else says against it. It doesn't change the fact. It's the same as when we talk about mathematics, that 2 plus 2 always equals 4. There is never a world, there is never an instance in which that isn't the case. In the same way, it doesn't matter how many versions of the Bible are put out there, and many of them are they're false. But it doesn't matter how many different truths, how many different books people write, how many different websites there are out there, how many different religions there are. It doesn't change the fact that the gospel itself is the way, the truth, and the life. And there is no changing that. That's why we do what we do. That's why we teach these things. That's why we go out and witness to others, because unless the gospel, the truth is spread, everybody out there is going to be blind. And blind people have to search for a way, right? They can't see, so they have to look for a way. They have to try to find the way themselves unless they have help. And how many times do you think a blind individual, if they don't know the way to a place, are going to find it successfully without help? It's going to be very difficult. And so in the same way, that's why the gospel is called the light of the world. That's why Jesus Christ is the way, the truth, the light. And why we are light, or the way, the truth, the life, but he also calls himself the light of the world, and he calls us the light of the world because we have the gospel, which can give that truth to others. And so that's why the gospel is so important. That's why it was so important that Jesus explained to Pilate, this isn't about Rome. This isn't about the chief priests and scribes. This isn't about me inciting violence or causing people to riot. This is about me giving the truth, and it's about people not wanting it. And that's the same conflict that we see today, that when there is strife in this world between Christians and unbelievers, it is because we have the truth and because the world does not want to accept it. And eventually they're going to be judged accordingly. And so he says or it says, and when he had said this, what is truth, he went out again unto the Jews and said unto them, I find in him no fault at all. Remember, the accusations that they were bringing before Pilate about Jesus were not that he makes us angry, that he takes authority away from us, that he makes us look bad in front of the people. The only way that he could be convicted to death was if there was some kind of political crime that Jesus had done against Rome, and that was simply not the case. And you remember that we've talked about this, of how that really, in order for Jesus to be able to retain that testimony of being perfect, of never having sinned, he could not be legally convicted of a crime in a court of law. Otherwise, that would have ruined his testimony, right? So there couldn't be anything that he had ever done. He had to be innocent. Now, are innocent people sometimes convicted of crimes? Unfortunately, yes. But in this instance, there was no evidence. There was no, he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was simply that Jesus Christ, again, had the truth and the people rejected it. So he says, I find in him no fault at all. So we see that Pilate counter questions Jesus. He simply asks if Jesus is the King of the Jews, but during this conversation realizes that there is no dispute between Jesus Christ and Rome. There's no dispute between him and Pilate or the government. And so Pilate could not offer a lawful conviction. As a judge, Pilate could not find fault with Christ, since none of their claims of a political crime could be proven. And so instead, they tried to convict him of inciting riot. They couldn't prove these things. And if we look back in the book of Luke, in the book of Luke, chapter 23, we come to the next event of the night. So we've seen that Pilate could not offer a lawful conviction. So we might ask, well, if Pilate couldn't lawfully convict Jesus Christ of a crime, if there wasn't any actual reason why Jesus was being put to death, or why the Jews wanted to put him to death, why didn't Pilate just tell them to be on their way? Why didn't Pilate just say, get out of my judgment hall? You don't have, your case doesn't hold water. There's no reason for us to even be carrying on this conversation. You're wasting my time. Why didn't Pilate just stand his ground? Well, Pilate was a very weak individual, for one thing. But also, he knew that the Jews could cause him a lot of trouble. They had in the past. And there needed to be some kind of a union between Pilate and the religious leaders in order for Pilate to be able to retain his authority. If it looked like Pilate was not able to crush any riot or any sort of uprising as soon as it happened, Rome was going to call him back. And the end of that wasn't going to be good. In fact, when we looked at who Pilate was, he eventually was called back to Rome to stand trial for violence against the innocent. And so I don't know the exact aftermath of that or what happened to him. That wasn't recorded, but we do know that he was, in fact, called back to stand trial at Rome. So he already knows at this point, and that didn't happen very long after these events took place. So he already knows that he's walking on thin ice. So if we take that into consideration, if we look in Luke chapter 23, verse 4, it says, Then Pilate said to the chief priests and to the people, I find no fault in this man. So he's had this conversation with Jesus, which we don't have recorded in Luke, but we find in John. And so he goes back and says, I find no fault in him. And they were the more fierce, saying, He stirs up the people teaching throughout all Jewry, or talking about Israel, beginning from Galilee and to this place. When Pilate heard of Galilee, he asked whether the man were a Galilean. So we do know that Jesus' ministry was primarily right around the Sea of Galilee, right? And so with that being the case, Pilate immediately, a light bulb goes on in his head, and he asks, "Oh, is he a Galilean?" And we see the reason for this in verse 7. As soon as he knew that he belonged unto Herod's district, or Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who himself also was at Jerusalem at that time. He sees an opportunity to pass this on to somebody else. He sees the opportunity, I might be able to just get out from under this altogether. Herod can deal with it. Herod was a Greek, but he was appointed to the title of king, and we use that term loosely. He was still under Rome's authority, but he acted like a king. He was not a good individual. In fact, the only reason that he was set up in this position of authority was political, because he had a decent relationship with the Jews. Because he was part Jew, part Greek. His family was Greek, but he held a Jewish position. And so there was some kind of an alliance that could be found between Herod and the Jews. So it was beneficial for Rome to have him there. It was beneficial for him to be in a place of authority because it kind of helped settle things. Rather than just Pilate, just a Roman presence, they softened that by having Herod over the northern jurisdiction of Israel at that time as well. And so when he hears that Jesus primarily was from Galilee, he sends him to Herod. And when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceeding glad, for he was desirous to see him of a long season, because he had heard many things of him, and he hoped to have seen some miracle done by him. And here's where I want us to see a difference between the conversation that Jesus has with Herod and the conversation that he had with Pilate. Remember, when Pilate asked Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus asked, "Okay, are you asking me that because you sincerely want to know, or because the Jews told you to ask, because they were convicting me of this?" When we look at Jesus' conversation with Herod, we see that it's actually non-existent. It says in verse 9, end of verse 8, he had heard many things of him and hoped to have seen some miracle done by him. Then he questioned with him in many words, but he answered him nothing. And the chief priests and scribes stood vehemently and accused him. He answered him nothing. And this is really where I think we see the difference between somebody who is searching for the truth and somebody who is looking for, we might say, by curiosity. Somebody who's simply searching for a sensation. Somebody who's looking for something to make them feel good, you might say. Pilate wasn't looking for Jesus to make him feel better. He wasn't looking to have his conscience eased. And I think in this particular instant, he truly was looking to set Jesus Christ free. He was truly looking for justice. Herod is looking for a sensation. He's looking to have his curiosity satisfied. He's representing somebody who simply is looking for something new, who's bored, and wants to see what something is all about. Jesus doesn't reveal himself to that type of individual. If somebody is looking to the church because they truly are looking for the truth, or they're looking for a peace that they don't have, Christ is going to reveal himself to them. If you are looking for salvation, if you are looking for eternal security, Jesus will show you the way. But if you're simply coming to the church because you think the church might be able to do something for you, or because you think that the worship team at the church does a really good job, or because you think that the environment is really great for your kids. And that's not to say that having a good environment in the church for your children is a good influence and that that's a bad thing, or that getting a blessing out of the song service is not a good thing. But if you are not looking to be spiritually filled, if you are not looking for the truth, Christ isn't going to reveal himself to you. And that comes with the heart. It comes with the heart being prepared for a change, to be filled with the Spirit, to be willing to make those changes in order to see that to have that peace that we talk about that passes all understanding, that peace that only comes with salvation. Herod didn't desire this. He simply wanted to see a miracle done. He was exceeding glad. He thought that he was going to be able to ask Jesus to do a miracle, that Jesus was going to do that miracle, and that Herod was going to say, oh, see, he did this miracle. He's obviously the Messiah, or some sort of a Messiah. So you don't have a case. This is all going to have a happy ending. Here's your Messiah you were looking for. He does these wonderful works. I've seen it with my own eyes. Let's everybody be happy and go their own separate ways. That's what Herod is looking for. But because he was not looking for the truth, it says, and he questioned with him in many words, but he answered him nothing. Again, Jesus does not reveal himself to those who are simply looking to have their curiosity satisfied. So he is referred unto Herod, who did not have any interest in the power of Jesus Christ to save, but simply wanted to see a miracle done. And we can see that is in fact the case in verse 11. And Herod sent his men of war, or Herod with his men of war, set him at naught, and mocked him, and arrayed him in a gorgeous robe, and sent him again to Pilate. And the same day Pilate and Herod were made friends together, for before they were at enmity between themselves. So we can definitely see that Herod's point here is not to search for justice. And in fact, this could have been part of the reason that the strife that there was between Herod and Pilate was kind of eased, and that they had a better relationship going forward. I think Herod looked at Jesus being sent to him as a joke. I think that he saw that there wasn't a case, and that he thought that Pilate was sending Jesus to him that because he wanted him to see how crazy the Jews were acting, how crazy their accusations were, that there's this individual and they're all up in arms about him and they're saying they want him crucified. And I think that Herod had this idea that this was something that was supposed to be funny. That this was something that was supposed to be a means of enjoyment. Oh, it's a feast. We're both here in Jerusalem. Here's a crazy case I got. See what's going on over here. And we can see that because of the mocking in verse 11, that he treated him with contempt. That's what that term "set at naught" means. It means that Herod treated Christ with contempt, mocked him, arrayed him in a gorgeous robe, sent him again to Pilate. He says he's a king. Let's put this robe on him. Let's mock him. And it says that Herod with his men of war did this. It wasn't that Herod sent Jesus to his armed guards to bring him back to Pilate, and the armed guards decided to make a mockery of Jesus Christ. Herod is very much involved in all of this. And so he returns him unto Pilate, which is where we see the final judgment before the crucifixion actually takes place. If we look back in Matthew chapter 27, where we'll finish up today, Matthew chapter 27, it says in verse 15, "Now at the feast, the governor was wont," or traditionally he released unto the people, "a prisoner whom they would." Now this is a familiar idea, and we see that in other places in history. Hundreds of years ago during the carnival at Rome, which was full of debauchery and terrible things, kind of like Mardi Gras is today. Essentially, it was celebrating the same thing. The time before Lent began in the Roman Catholic Church. But at the beginning of those celebrations, before they would begin fasting, and they would get all of their excess energy and desire and all of these things out before going into a period of fasting, which is not the way that we should treat fasting or self-sacrifice for the Lord. But they would traditionally have an execution and a pardon. And so the Pope would pardon one individual who was a convicted criminal, and they would execute one who was a convicted criminal. And that's something that we see throughout history, but this is something that was a tradition at the Feast of the Passover, is that the governor would release unto the people a prisoner whom they desired. And that was also a part of Rome offering an olive branch or offering peace to the chief priests and rulers. This was part of that relationship that they had, that they would release a prisoner. And they had then a notable prisoner called Barabbas. Now, Barabbas was definitely a convicted criminal. It says that he was a notable criminal. If we look in the book of John and Mark, and I'm not going to turn there, but he was called a robber. He was called a murderer. He was a zealot, meaning that he drove the people, he worked up the people to violence, to rebel against Rome. So he did all of these things. If there was anybody that was guilty of the things that the priests were accusing Jesus Christ of, it would have been Barabbas. Therefore, it says in verse 17, when they were gathered together, Pilate said unto them, Whom will ye that I release unto you? Barabbas or Jesus, which is called Christ? For he knew that for envy they delivered him. So essentially what Pilate is doing is saying, okay, you're accusing Jesus of these things. He obviously has not done any of these things. He's innocent. So I'm going to appeal to your sense of lawfulness. I'm going to appeal to your sense of justice. Here is an individual who has done all of those things. Not only has he done what you're accusing Jesus of, but he's also robbed. He's also murdered. He's done all of these things. So if we're to set up a comparison between the two, it's obvious that you have to choose Jesus to be released. There's no way that you can think Jesus is worse than Barabbas. And so, again, we see the weakness of Pilate, that instead of just simply saying, you don't have a case, you're wasting my time, get out of my judgment hall, he instead is trying to find any means that he can to avoid blame. First, he tries to pawn him off on Herod. When he gets sent back, he tries to release Jesus Christ according to tradition instead of Barabbas. We see just a little bit of a note here, which is interesting in verse 19. When he was set down on the judgment seat, his wife sent unto him, saying, Have nothing to do with this just man, for I have suffered many things this day in a dream. because of him. And Matthew is the only book of the Bible that records this. But it is interesting because not only was Pilate a man who I believe was searching for some sense of truth, but he also was a very superstitious individual. And his wife was even more superstitious than he was. So we can see that there was every opportunity for Christ to be released lawfully. First of all, he should have never been convicted, or never been accused, I should say, in the first place. But when he was accused, it should have been immediately thrown out. Herod should have seen that there was no case. Pilate did see that there was no case, tries to get the Jews to pick a robber and a murderer over Jesus Christ. His sense of superstition is appealed to whenever his wife sends to him and says, don't have anything to do with this case. Leave it be. Let him go. But the chief priests and elders persuaded the multitude that they should ask Barabbas and destroy Jesus. The governor answered and said unto them, whether of the twain will ye that are released unto you? And they said, Barabbas. Pilate says, what shall I do then with Jesus, which is called Christ? And they say unto him, let him be crucified. And sadly, Pilate allows the multitude, the crying of the people, the demands of the people to sway his judgment. And again, we did, like we said, Pilate was already walking on thin ice with Rome. He needed to stop the rioting. He needed to stop the anger, to stop the crying out, the demanding. He needed to put an end to this. Does that mean that he is guiltless? Absolutely not. And in the book of Mark, I believe it is, let me see if it was in the book of Mark. It might not have been. I neglected to write this down. But in one of the other Gospels, where Jesus is brought before Pilate, he specifically says to Pilate that Pilate is going to be held in lower guilt than the people. And it might have been in the book of John where we just were. But Pilate, the bottom line is Pilate does not escape guilt. And the reason is because it was with him to convict or release Jesus. And when he chose not to, he made his position very clear. Now, he attempts to wash his hands, literally and figuratively. In verse 24, when Pilate saw that he could prevail nothing, but that the tumult was made, he took water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, I am innocent of the blood of this just person. See ye to it. And as we end today, I want to note that he says, see ye to it, because that's the second time in the trial of Jesus Christ that this phrase has been used. We see that also with Judas. When Judas decided that, or realized that he had made a mistake, and brings the 30 pieces of silver that he was paid back to the chief priests, he says in verse 4 of the same chapter in Matthew, I have sinned. I have betrayed the innocent blood. They said, what is that to us? See thou to that. In this whole case, we see just time after time of people trying to pass the blame. People trying to pass the guilt. But what we actually see is that everybody had a part in that guilt. Not just these individuals that actually condemned Jesus Christ to death, not the people that actually put him on the cross to put him to death, to crucify him, but every single one of us, because the reason for this required sacrifice is our sin, past, present, and future. Not just that Adam and Eve sinned in the garden and so a sacrifice had to be made. It wasn't our fault, it was Adam and Eve, but it had to be done. No, it's because every single one of us has sinned, because we have been estranged from God, because we were born children of this world, children in bondage to Satan. Because that sacrifice was required, this is what had to happen. But nobody, not the rulers, not the chief priests, none of them escaped judgment. And in the same way, we will only escape judgment if we turn to Jesus Christ for salvation. In fact, the chief priests say in verse 25, "Then answered all the people and said, 'His blood be on us and on our children.'" Not only were they willing to take on the guilt for their crime, but they were willing to pass that guilt on to their children, which they did. And I think that was symbolic for the sin nature being passed down from Adam to every single individual that lives on this earth and has ever lived. We are all a part of that sin nature. And as we can see, that guilt does in fact pass on, and so does the judgment. But we know that there is an escape from that, and we will see the sacrifice necessary for that salvation taking place in our next lesson. But let's go ahead and pray, and we'll prepare for the morning service. Dear Heavenly Father, I thank you for this day that you've given to us. I pray that you would just be with us and speak to our hearts. Use this to help us to understand how needful this sacrifice was, and just how desperately we need to make use of that, and to understand how desperate we are in need of salvation. I pray, God, that you would just bless the services to follow. I give Pastor Golden the words to say. In your name I pray. Amen. You are dismissed, and we'll meet back together at 11 o'clock.